This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we present Risk Revolution, a monthly series intended to advance the maturity of risk management practices within the industry by covering topics that challenge quality professionals to continuously seek opportunities to improve and advance the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, our series coordinators, Lori and Nuala, continue their discussion with guest Randy Friedman. More to come in this lively discussion on the ways in which bias and heuristics impact risk management, risk identification, and the decisions made during the process. So welcome back to all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. We are so glad to be back to continue this really important discussion around human bias and human heuristics and the impact that can have on our risk management processes. And I guess this time round, we're ready to roll up our sleeves and get specific and talk about some particular types of biases, and more importantly for our listeners, to really give them some tips and hints on how they can reduce that impact. So over to you, Lori. Where do you want to start?
Well, welcome again to Randy as well. Thanks for joining us for part two. So as we get going, so Nuala set a nice stage, and just to remind everyone too about those distinctions, bias being that human characteristic of favoring one thing over another thing, and heuristics being that shortcut in decision making based on very little data, but rather that the outcome served us well. So, and it's very primitive in its nature, and something that I think Nuala gave a great example, sort of from the old days of cavemen, if you will, of survival, right? So because that served us well and we survived, we continue to make that same decision. So I want to jump in today with some examples. And if you were to Google bias and heuristics, you would, there are many, and there's different descriptions of them. And you probably would be overwhelmed to some degree and go, oh my goodness, all is lost, right? I'm flawed as a human. I have these, I'm incapable of making solid decisions, and that's not true. So today we'll cover a little bit of what are some examples of some biases or heuristics that we've experienced, and then how we better manage these. So I'll kick off the group a little bit with an example that one of my favorite biases that I see pretty often actually, and it's called present bias. So it's one where we innately in the name sort of live in the present, and we make that decision based on that instant gratification, if you will. How quickly am I going to reach some sort of good outcome for myself as a human? And a study that's quite often done, and you can also find this on the internet as well, and there's some nice YouTube videos that show it, that's done at universities, is they'll use children to sort of study this present bias. And I like to show it when I deliver courses as well, so anyone that's trained with me has probably seen it. But the study goes like this, and they'll use various age groups to do this, but they'll sit a child in a room by themselves, and on a plate in front of them, there's a marshmallow. And the study, the lead study person will actually say to the child that if you wait for 10 minutes, I think it is, and not eat this marshmallow, I'll give you 2. Okay, but you have to wait, and you can't touch that marshmallow, right? And they'll leave the child. And watching them on the video as this child's left alone is hilarious. And I like delivering this in a class because it teaches bias, but it also is a moment to sort of have some comedic relief in an intense class usually. But they'll sit there and they'll literally just be like biting their nails, they're smelling the marshmallow, they're picking it up and looking at it. Sometimes they lick it. You know, it's very difficult for them to wait for that second marshmallow. And the truth is, it's extremely difficult for humans to wait, adults to wait for that second marshmallow. And I would argue that's probably getting worse with our society because of the instant information that's fed to us, the instant things I can purchase. I have an Amazon warehouse 5 minutes from my house. I literally can receive something an hour after I've ordered it. So present bias is something that can be very challenging to manage, but that video just gives a great example of it. Now, to sum up that study, There are some children that will wait for that second marshmallow, but very few. Most of them eventually ended up taking a bite out of it. Some of them will actually try to lie about having eaten a piece of it, and they'll try to hide the little corner that they ate or something like that. But the study actually concludes, they follow some of these children for a long time, and they'll find out that as adults, their decision making is a little bit different because they're able to wait for that gratification versus maybe somebody who's seeking for the instant. So how does that translate in risk management? Where that translates in risk management that I often see it is if I'm practicing present bias, I'm looking for the quick remediation to that risk. So let's say this is quite a large risk and maybe it requires a capital project to manage that over time. What you'll see a lot of times is we'll put an interim control in place because this project may take some time and in the interim we're living with that risk. So let's put in some sort of band-aid that we know can better manage it. What ends up happening if present bias is very strong is that long-term mitigation will never happen because the interim mitigation is sort of, kind of sort of bumbling along and it's serving the purpose. So no one then wants to make that investment because that requires money and resources. And we sort of forget, oh yeah, there was that project, but we haven't seen that risk again, right? Like it hasn't ever been realized. So that bias, you really have to be careful with that because interim mitigations are not likely intended to survive for the long run, right? They could end up sort of breaking down and that long-term mitigation never got worked on then. So that's one example of where I see it. But what I'd like to find out is, Nuala, what's an example of a bias or heuristic that you've sort of witnessed, and how do you see that show itself in the risk management process?
Yeah, well, I think for many of us, we've seen the anchoring and adjustment one happening when we come into risk scoring activities and risk evaluation activities. So that is where we have a situation where, if our scoring method, it requires us to go 1, 3, 5, 7, 10, whatever that might be, whatever our scale might be. And again, Randy mentioned in our earlier episode that if a subject matter expert is sitting in the room, or a number of subject matter experts, and they make a call on something, everybody tends to lean towards where their view is. And that's the point of this anchor. So if somebody in the room, either someone who is further up the hierarchy, may have more of a power base perception for the others in the room, or maybe a subject matter expert, and they say, oh, this is a 3, or this is a low risk, or whatever, then everybody in the room, you might have another 8 or 10 people in the room, are going to be thinking, right, so he thinks it's a 3. Well, do I anchor from that 3, and am I a 2 or a 4, or am I right there with that person? And so they adjust around that anchor point, and they're not really thinking about the other end of the scale. So that's one of the things, and we can come back and look at how we can address those kind of issues. And it's one of the reasons why, I have a particular breakout when it comes to risk scoring. There's so many things wrong with our ordinal scales and the way in which we manage risk scoring, and this is just one of the things to add upon all the other layers of problems we have when we try and reduce risk to a set of scores and manage it within a threshold. So that anchoring and adjustment, we see that happening all the time in risk scoring activities. The other one, and we'll come again at this from another angle of a solution, but the availability heuristic. And that really is depending on whether you've had an experience or not, or what your experience of a given risk event was. You will have a particular mindset around how that risk is. Now, where I find that availability risk really comes into play, or that heuristic around availability really comes into play in formal risk management processes, is we don't actually seek out those people who have had those experiences. We don't make that part of our process. We might have 10 people in the room, and like I said in our part 1 of this, we may have people who are in the direct line of fire. We may have people who are maybe more in a kind of an above site role, a tech ops support role. And we don't actually say, has anybody ever encountered a situation where they've seen this risk event occurring? And if so, could you speak up now? And we invite you to share your experience. Instead, what happens is people have a view of, oh, I think that happened to me before, or that happened last week, or it happened yesterday. So therefore, I'm really going to score that high, because I'm really feeling the pain from that recent batch rejection or deviation or investigation that I've had. Instead of actually looking at the fact that we may only have had the 3 of those events over a period of time. And so it kind of goes into that law of small numbers thing as well, depending on how we view those things. But that availability thing is an opportunity for us to turn that into an insight, rather than something that can take away from the accuracy of your risk. So we'll look at that when we talk about solutions. They're just 2 that I see routinely.
Yeah, I agree. I those are two great examples as well. Randy, how about you? What do you see when you're in risk management activities that show up?
Yeah, great question. I think, one of the challenges with bias is sometimes people get concerned that they're not necessarily going to name the bias correctly or understand exactly what it means. And I think, what my experience has been is that's not as important as just when I think innately as humans, we kind of can sense sometimes when things maybe just don't make sense. And so, not being so concerned about saying, oh, that's a recency bias, or that's the anchoring bias, or that's this bias or that, right? And I think also, bringing them up in the context of risk assessment, sometimes that way can seem confrontational to people, right? So I really like what, Nuala said earlier about, being in the previous session about being curious and just, asking questions about, why do people think the things that they think, and, tell us a little bit about what that experience is. So I think that is a, really useful understanding. And the other part of it is that realizing that I don't think oftentimes these biases don't occur independent of one another, right? They kind of come in clusters, right? And, so for me, some of the ones that I see grouped together sometimes is, there's one called a knowledge bias, right? Which is the tendency to choose the option one knows best rather than the best option, right? Because we're more educated about that. So we think that's the right thing, right? And then there's another one that's called the curse of knowledge, right? Which is where you have better informed people find it extremely difficult to think problems from the perspective of lesser informed people or perceived lesser informed, right? I mean, this is, again, the what was the lemon term that Nuala used, right? The people that have been around for a long time and burned their fingers many times, right? It's like
elder lemons.
Elder lemon, yes. And you're the junior lemon, right? That's just fallen from the tree, the new engineer. And one of the most beautiful moments I ever had in a risk assessment was where we had kind of that situation. We had this a team of experts, some people that have been in the industry 30 years. And then we had some engineers that had just, recently graduated in the last few years. And they started bringing up questions and challenging these guys. And it was in a really constructive way that deepened the dialogue. And what ended up happening is that the elder lemons walked away having learned something, right? They started thinking about their problem differently, right? But a big part of that was because of the way it was approached, right? It wasn't like, oh, geez, you're doing this and it's wrong. It was like, oh, tell me a little bit more about this. My experience has been this. So I think, bias gets addressed, we're going to go into more detail, but a big part of bias is like not being afraid of it, right? I mean, again, I said this in the previous episode, is that we have such a negative response when we hear that word, or even when we think that we're being biased, right? We're just, we kind of clam up. And as soon as you have that sort of tension or fear response, your creativity goes out the window, right? And one of the things you're really trying to bring to the table with risk management is that, that creativity and that, out of the box kind of thinking. So.
Yeah, I love that. I have to comment on your biases too, because I loved the examples as well. And there's a game that you can actually play. That's a board game. There's 2 versions of it. I think there's a family version and an adult version or something. And it's called Wits and Wagers. And I don't know if anyone's played that before. And I love to play it with when my kids were really little, because, well, one, they're teenagers now, so they're just not as fun. But secondly, when they're little, it's really fun to watch bias at play, because the questions in this game are, something to the effect of how many hamburgers, if you stacked them end to end, would it take to get from the Earth to the moon? No one's going to know that answer. Okay, right? I even challenge how they made the game, to determine that answer. I'm sure they extrapolated for using math, but regardless, my kids, were little, and you're supposed to write down, your number in secret, right? And then when you reveal it, everybody sort of wagers, who's the closest to the correct answer, right? So there's anchor bias. There's so much at play here. But my kids would always look at my husband or I based on the level of knowledge they thought I had, or we had on that topic. Now, thankfully, they often looked at my husband for the hamburger responses and not to me. But I think it's such a great game that as we lead into our second question here, that you can use to kind of break up a little bit like a risk assessment session and bring awareness to bias. Because people do look at certain, like, well, that person looks like they might have knowledge on, the distance between the Earth and the moon. And that person looks like maybe they eat, I don't know, they enjoy hamburgers or something. They might know, this information. That's where this bias kind of shows itself a little bit. And it might be a fun activity to help people bring awareness that we've been talking throughout this entire podcast about. That's part of managing bias. So now that everyone knows what wits and wagers are, and you can, buy your own copy of that game, let's jump into the second question. We have a little bit of understanding of bias heuristics. We might be a little overwhelmed at the amount of different versions there are out there, and the fact that we now know that we're shortcutting sometimes without as much data as we need to make appropriate decisions. How do we go about managing this? Bring us back to feeling more positive about this topic, and managing this in a good manner during a risk assessment session. And we'll start with Nuala. What are some exercises and things you've done to bring awareness or to manage these behaviors during a risk assessment session or a risk-based decision-making activity?
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. They have it there in the game, the secret voting.
Yes.
I use this all the time now when we're looking for risk scores. And I will have the facilitator ensure that we're gonna, and we'll have explained it at the beginning, why we're not gonna, nobody's gonna shout out the number. You're gonna write it down, hand it up on a Post-it. And you can actually overcome, I think as Randy said there, these things don't happen in isolation. They can conflate themselves, these different biases. And so by that confidential voting, you can kill two birds with one stone, because now the facilitator can look, okay, we've got 10 people in the room. And if we're using a 1-3-5, for instance, 8 people are thinking it's a 3. One person thinks it's a 5 and one person thinks it's a 1. Now, who are the 2 people we need to talk to? They're the 2 outliers that we need to get their opinions. They may have more information. They may have that availability bias playing on them, saying, oh, well, that happened to me yesterday, so therefore it's definitely a 5 for me. But it's interesting, very often, I've definitely used this phrase before, a consensus is the enemy of good risk management. And yet many of our risk management processes, our formal processes, are kind of driving us towards getting this consensus so we can all get out of the room and get back to our day job. And for me, it is about that risk curiosity. And I love to think about, if we could, we've talked about formal and informal tools as well before. If we could get risk management much more as an honest dialogue, much less of a kind of a documented process. We can document, of course, we need to keep the formal documentation, but if when we have the experts in the room or the people with the most opportunity to impact the organization's exposure to that risk, if we could create it much more as an honest dialogue where people like those young engineers are able to ask the subject matter experts and question them and challenge them, then that's a rich environment where we're going to gain knowledge and learning. So that's one of the key things. And actually coaching people, the subject matter experts, I'm on a mission to ban that term from our industry, because I think it encourages people to become knowledge hoarders rather than knowledge sharers. So I'd love to think of all of our SMEs being rebranded as knowledge stewards or stewards of knowledge, because that's much more about sharing that knowledge than being, the central repository of knowledge is power. So coaching those subject matter experts to not just give their opinion, to actually ask questions of the team and kind of open the dialogue rather than close it down. And I know I mentioned Brené Brown in part one of this. I was actually listening to a podcast last night with Brené Brown and Adam Grant. And one of the things she said, it was so much I had to make a note in my iPhone. She said, as experts, we are trained to be the knower and be right, instead of be the learner and get it right. And I think that is so valuable. If we could think about our risk management activities and getting our subject matter experts, when they come in for that subjectivity piece, to think about getting it right and learning from the process. It's a learning process, and it's part of our knowledge management process. That would be so good. So the confidential voting it really works well in a facilitated session in the room. However, nobody's allowed to sit in the room anymore. So for the past year, I've been working with everybody in these virtual environments. And if we think risk management activities and risk assessments are bad when you have to sit in a stuffy room for a day, try doing it via Zoom. It's a killer. And try and keep the level of engagement up and keep people with their cameras on and their microphones on. It's really tough. So my advice and what I've learned in the last year in working with teams is break it right down. Don't try and eat the whole elephant in one go. Literally you break it all down. So break each individual task down, get people engaged in a really, upbeat, active, engaged session for an hour and a half tops. More than that, don't have them in a group of 10, 12, 14, whatever you might have in your room. Break them into breakout sessions. Put 3 and 4 folks in a room together and give them individual questions to ask and to create, and then get them back into the room and have them report out. So you're not dragging the information out of them, and it's much more vibrant, rather than, some people find it very, very hard to hit the unmute button when there's 14 or 20 people in a call. So you'll get a couple of folks who will continue to contribute, and others who will, you're checking if they've still got a pulse at the end of the session. So there's that. And then you can bring this confidential voting, and I've done this with teams as well. Use the chat box, so nobody gets to call out the number. Is it a 135, whatever? Use the chat box, and again, use that like you would have with a yellow post-it in the room, and then everybody says, okay, score now, and they all score, and then you can see, okay, well, we've got 2 outliers, let's have a discussion around those outliers. And that can strengthen the whole process and turn it much more away from filling in these columns and rows, and much more into that honest dialogue, which is what we're driving for. So Randy, any thoughts?
Yeah, so Nuala, some excellent points. I really like what you said about the quote from Brené Brown and I think you said Adam Grant. I think that construct, not only to risk management, but I think the pharmaceutical industry, or really any manufacturing industry, right, where you're making, or maybe not even manufacturing, just in general, right? I mean, really having that perspective of, being a learner and getting it right, as opposed to having the knowledge and knowing it's right, is huge. And I think, if we look at over time trends that we see in the industry, and where we continue to be challenged around, people continue to ask this question. It's like, risk management was supposed to be this great thing that was going to give us all this opportunity, right? And 15 years later now, after the introduction of ICHQ9, we're still kind of scratching our heads going, why isn't that happening, right? And I think there are practitioners that understand what's going on, and I think a lot of it is based to that back to that quote is that we're too much focused on trying to get it right, out of the box, and as opposed to learning, right? And risk management is really a learning opportunity. So I think, from a bias perspective, the space I try to create in a risk assessment, similar to what you're saying, is really, this idea of having a place that's safe, right? So people can bring up things that are questionable, right? Or, they wouldn't normally bring up in the right environment. Nuala, I think you brought the point up about, making sure that, leadership isn't necessarily in the room. That can inhibit people, right? So finding ways to make sure you've got the right people in the room. I will actually, depending on the nature of the risk assessment and the preparation time, I'll actually talk to the person that's leading it and get some information about the people that are involved, right? To understand, do we have some people on the team that often show up as very strong voices and tend to dominate the conversation, right? Or do we have people that maybe aren't as talkative, right? And I'll go and talk to those people ahead of the risk assessment just to get to understand a little bit more about their perspective, how they approach things, and start to have really this conversation, what you're saying about, the knowledge steward, right? How can they bring their expertise to the table, right? And what empowers them to speak up in the meeting, right? And I think, the other part of it is, for me, is stepping way back early into the process. I think what helps start to eliminate some of the bias and effects in the risk management activity is standardizing how we define, what are the risks that we might expect to see in unit operations, right? Because much of what we do in the pharmaceutical industry is very consistent, right? Year over year or whatever, from the beginning of the development stage. But we don't necessarily sit down and say, here's the types of things that you can expect to see, right? Development hasn't necessarily quantified those and passed those on to manufacturing, right? By the time it gets there, it's like everybody's kind of reinventing every time they look at the process. And so I think the opportunity to start early from a standardization standpoint, that means every time we look, now what we're doing is we're looking at improving the information we already have as opposed to starting from ground zero. And I think, lastly is, again, back to kind of being curious and making sure people really understand, the point of the Socratic method, right? Which is to ask inquiring questions, not from the perspective of you're right or I'm wrong, but from the perspective of, wow, I want to learn more about what you know, right? And that helps me create a better decision. And I think, the last thing, one of the metrics that I have around risk assessments, and I tell this people at the beginning, is I said, by the end of this session, you should have learned something. And if you're not learning something, I want you to tell me. And two, I want you to ask yourself, why are you not learning anything new, right? You've got all this knowledge and expertise in the room here. That should be causing us to make new connections and understand things in different ways. So.
Oh, I love that last thought, Randy, for sure. I had never asked that question. I think that's really powerful. What kind of responses have you got? I mean, have you got some good dialogue out of that as well?
Yeah, we've had some really good dialogue and had some challenges. I mean, I've had some people that have flat out just said, you can't teach me, risk management is a waste of time and I don't learn anything every time I've ever been in this. And like, they repeatedly come to risk assessment sessions and the difficult thing is that they'll say that in front of everybody else. And, depending on how people respond to that. Now, the good news is that what's actually happened is the participants will kind of look at them and like, wow, really? And they'll be like, well, I learned this and I learned this. And so, I don't know what's going on obviously in that person's head, but the good part is that everybody else is starting to speak up, right? They're kind of like getting it. They're like, yeah, this is cool. I learned something, right? This was a good use of my time. Nuala, back to what you said about bringing that positive energy, right? It's so easy to get just dragged down and like, oh, this is so boring, right? But for me, it's like, what did you learn new today, right? And it may not even necessarily be specifically about this process, but what did you learn about the risk management process or how you think about information, right? I think, to me, the challenge in this for us is, how do we continue to stay engaged and continue to press ourselves for new knowledge and new understanding, right? That's where the innovation comes in, right? It's not just saying, oh, I'm this innovative person, right? But it's like you personally have to be willing to like understand what's your process and how do you motivate yourself to come at something from a new perspective, right? Or interject into one of your biases, right? So, I mean, for me, I think another thing to help that energy is I will look at, a particular bias that I may want to work at during the risk assessment, right? I may or not share that with the team, right? But that's an opportunity for me to kind of be focused on a particular topic, help me come through that process as something new. Because, after you've facilitated risk assessments for years, sometimes you're like, oh, it'd be really easy to go, oh, this is just boring, right? but it's not. It's so much fun because there's so much about the human condition, I think, that gets expressed in these, and it's a great learning opportunity.
That's so true. I appreciate that as well. And I'll just close out with my thoughts. I think you guys have both given such great examples. Last thing I'll say is I think the education, which both of you have covered, is important, and being open and transparent that bias and heuristics exist, and that it's okay because that's sort of how we're wired. But being aware of if you're carrying a bias. And just a couple of quick exercises I might consider too is sometimes I'll just flat out ask the team at the very beginning, what are your risks? And I don't care what order they come in. What's the thing that's most concerning to you? And sometimes those biases will come out right away. They don't know they're called that. We don't have to name it, but that's the thing that's on my mind that I'm coming here to talk about right at this meeting, and it kind of gets out there. The other thing I'll say is teaching a course on it to people before you do a risk assessment that maybe is really short, talks a little bit about it, makes the environment feel safe to own it, and do a fun exercise. Randy and I, eons ago, used to teach classes together. And one of the activities we used to do was we would give people a card that had information on it, typically numbers, because people anchor to those really easily. And I think, Nuala, you've already brought that up. But we would give them this card in relation to the question we were going to ask them, which was something along the lines of how long is the longest river in the world, or how tall is the tallest tree in the world? And we would give them a card that maybe was something comparable, like maybe it has the height of Big Ben or the length of the Titanic, right? And they don't know that everyone has a different card right in the room. And we then have them secretly come up and write how tall they think the tallest tree is on the board. And they'll typically be very close to whatever the card was that we gave them because they're anchoring to it. They really don't have anything else to cling to unless you happen to know how tall the tallest tree is. And I've taught some semblance of this many times over, and I still can't remember right now how tall the tallest tree is. So people will use that, and it's fun. They're like, oh, I get it now. Okay. And then they can sort of talk about bias a little bit. So that's kind of a fun activity. And lastly, I'll close out with, I think diversity is important in decision making and thought processes. And I think the more we're tapping into, the age groups, the length in career, the functional areas that people serve, I think that helps us manage bias to some degree because we're bringing all these different thoughts to the table. And if people are willing to listen and hear, I think that makes that risk-based decision making so much more powerful. But any last thoughts before we close out today?
Well, I just think the discussion has been so interesting and it's so relevant. And this really is a core aspect of anybody who's trying to advance the maturity of how their organization manages risk. And just one last thought in terms of following on from what Randy said there, as something that I've done a number of times where people are so locked into this, oh my God, there's a day of my life I'm not getting back. I just spent with a risk management activity. And why am I here? One of the ways, this is central to all of the work I do around patient-focused excellence. And patient-focused risk excellence is a key element as well. So, sometimes it's really useful when you're starting to work with a team of actually reminding them why are we here, and reintroducing them to the patient, because we have all these diverse programs going on across our various systems, and they may well have done their, patient testimonials, or they may have seen being involved in a town hall that saw some patient involvement, but actually reminding them why we're here, what can go wrong, even by looking at, pulling up some customer complaints that this product or another product has had, or a recall that your organization or another organization in a similar field have had, and saying, this is what we're here to try and avoid. This is why we're looking at risk, because these things still happen. As Randy said, with 15 years of ICHQ9, you'd think we'd have it nailed. But we still have recalls, we still have quality defects reaching the bedside. So I think sometimes, direction setting, calibrating at the very beginning to remind people these are the things that we're trying to avoid. And there's no need to be defensive, because we're not questioning your design or your the way in which you've developed all your SOPs and training or whatever it might be. There's no need to be defensive, but we just want to shake this down and make sure that we've captured everything. So that patient link is something that often isn't remembered in the risk assessment process. And I tend to do that, particularly when I'm working with teams for the first time.
Oh, and by the way, you talked about remote facilitation. I will say this, it has been very challenging. You're correct. What I like to do is actually I create fun emojis for the different risk levels. And it's funny how people get engaged in that. They're like, I'll say, oh, that sounds like a high risk, sad emoji. And then they're like, oh, and then they're looking for other, oh, that one looks like it's high too. They're suddenly embracing high risk because they want the different emojis. So don't underestimate trying to introduce a little fun in some of these remote sessions that we're in as well.
Well, great.
Yeah, thank you both for the opportunity to participate in this. It's been a great conversation. I would say, for people that are out there learning about risk management or heuristics and the rest of the stuff, the biggest thing is to just jump right in and give it a shot. And, if you're a new facilitator or you're learning, if you've got somebody that you've worked with before that's involved in the risk assessment, ask for some feedback afterwards, either privately or publicly. It's a great way to, for you to develop your skill set. I find it really helpful. I ask people usually in the class for any feedback, and especially around, ask them at the end. It's like, have you seen me introduce any bias or bring things up that you thought maybe were questionable? And it's a great opportunity because that shows some vulnerability and your willingness to learn and talk about that in a public forum, right? And that's really what this is about, right? At the end of the day, like Nuala said, why we're here every day is making products that treat our patients and deliver something effective and efficacious for them. So keep up the good work and always keep learning new things.
Thank you for joining us, Randy.
Thank you to all of you. Nuala, do you want to remind everybody what the takeaways are from this episode?
Yeah, we have been storing back two of my favorites. I use these all the time with teams and I teach them through the university. And they're from one of our favorite people, Dr. Kevin O'Donnell in the Irish Regulatory Authority, the HPRA, and also a team member of the Pharmaceutical Regulatory Science team at TU Dublin, where we're based. But Kevin wrote way back in 2010, 2 articles for JVT in May and again later in the year, I think in October, called Strategies for Addressing Problems of Subjectivity and Uncertainty in Quality Risk Management Exercises. And in the first one, he addresses the role of human heuristics. And in the second one, he gets into that area that Randy was talking about the perceptionist issues. And he also deals with some really cool strategies of how can you get more effective risk communications. So 2 great articles. I know they're over 10 years old, but they're still really relevant. And if anybody's interested, we'll have the links for those JVT articles in this week's show notes.
Excellent. Well, thank you again to our Risk Revolution leaders, Lori and Nuala. Thank you as well to Randy for sharing your expertise. It's been great to hear from all of you on this subject. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, always keeping us on track. Lastly, we are so grateful to you, our valued listeners. Thank you for your continued support of our show. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and don't forget to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really do appreciate your help in spreading the word. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, you can message us through our website or via LinkedIn. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, as well as links to those articles, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. Voices in Validation will be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.